They were a family who never stopped smiling even when their mouths were closed. And beneath the hollow where their house once stood, the earth still grinds its unseen teeth, waiting for the rest of us to join the meal. Wexler County, North Carolina, 1875. The valley lay low between two ridges, its fields yellowed from too many seasons of tobacco and too little rain. The air smelled of cured leaf and wood smoke, a sweetness that clung to every porch board and preacher's collar. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's sins by scent alone, and where gossip traveled faster than any sermon. When the first Delmere child was born, the midwife ran out of the house before dawn, apron streaked with blood, shouting that she had delivered a creature and not a babe. Those who gathered on the road thought she was drunk until she showed them the towel. There, in the half-light, lay a small mouth still slick with afterbirth, lined with a full set of teeth, not gums, not buds, but hard white crowns that gleamed like pearls from a coffin. The family doctor, Elias Reeve, rode out at daybreak expecting to find tragedy, but found instead a perfectly breathing infant. The girl, Clara, cooed softly while her mother, pale and near collapse, refused to meet his eyes. Reeve noted the anomaly in his ledger with the caution of a man already aware that some facts do not belong on paper. Dentition at birth, full adult formation, he wrote. He closed the book and never spoke of it again. But Wexler County had a way of prying open closed books. By the time the second Delmere child was born 2 years later, the story had grown teeth of its own. The blacksmith swore the boy had bitten through the birthing cord before the midwife could tie it. Children began to chant rhymes about the hungry ones up the hollow. Farmers crossed themselves when they saw the Delmere wagon rolling toward town, its curtains drawn tight even in daylight. At first, people treated it like a curiosity, a freak inheritance, perhaps a punishment for pride. Yet unease crept in through smaller things. Dogs barked when the Delmere children smiled. The youngest, a boy barely 5, was caught gnawing on a fence post as if tasting it. And on humid nights, when the crickets paused and the air hung heavy as cloth, neighbors claimed they could hear a soft grinding, a steady rhythm like stone on stone, coming from the Delmere farmhouse. By harvest season, few dared approach the hollow after sunset. The family still came to Sunday service, sitting silent in the back pew, their lips pressed together as though restraining something. When they bowed their heads in prayer, the congregation did not look at them, but at the floorboards instead, for fear that those closed mouths might open and reveal too much. In a valley built on faith and decay, even a smile could rot into something unholy, and the Delmeres' smiles, perfect, patient, and unchanging, became the one thing the whole county feared to see. The year was 1848, and the Delmere homestead sat half-swallowed by the pines of Bishop's Hollow, a lonely rise where mist seemed to gather and stay. The night Clara Delmere was born, thunder rolled far off in the Blue Ridge, and the rain came down so thick it drowned the frogs in the ditches. Inside the cabin, Margaret Delmere labored in silence, her husband pacing the floorboards with the helpless rhythm of men who can only listen. The midwife, Mrs. Adeline Perot, had attended births for 30 years and prided herself on not screaming, but before dawn broke, she would. When the child came, she came with a sound, not like crying, but like breathing drawn too sharply through clenched teeth. The midwife leaned in, cloth ready, but froze. The infant's mouth opened in a smile, a full, pale smile that gleamed even in the lamplight. Every tooth was there, not soft ridges or budding enamel, but a perfect set, white and small as bird bones. Before Mrs. Perot could react, the baby's head turned toward the umbilical cord and bit down. The sound a wet snap sent the woman stumbling backward, knocking over the basin. By the time Elias Delmere caught the child in his hands, she was quiet, lips slick with blood that wasn't hers. Mrs. Perot left that cabin before the sun rose, muttering prayers that did not sound like the ones spoken in Wexler County's church. She told anyone who would listen that she had seen a devil born, one who smiled before she took her first breath. The physician, called from town the next day, dismissed it all as nerves. Teeth at birth are a rarity, he told them. Nothing more. Yet when he pried the infant's jaw open with a spoon handle, he found not a few teeth, but 32, each rooted deep as an adult's. He made one note in his ledger and struck through it immediately. Years passed, and the story cooled until 1850, when Margaret bore another child, a boy they named Abner. The midwife this time was younger, less given to fear, but the result was the same. A clean birth, a quiet house, and a newborn who smiled before he cried. The sound came late, not a wail but something low, almost content. Word spread quickly through the valley. 2 infants, both born with the same impossible inheritance. Some said the Delmeres were blessed with strength. Others whispered the bloodline had been touched by hunger itself. By the following Sunday, the church pew behind the Delmeres sat empty. Reverend Childers spoke of unnatural blessings, though he never named the family outright. The mothers in the congregation clutched their children closer when Clara turned her head and grinned, her mouth too full for a 7-year-old. In that quiet wooden chapel, the echo of her laugh seemed to ring against the rafters, bright as the clink of cutlery. It was the first sound that truly unsettled Wexler County, not the cry of birth, but the smile that followed it. By the time Clara Delmere reached 10 years old, her classmates had long since left small ivory tributes under their pillows, tiny relics exchanged for coins and comfort. But in the Delmere house, no such rituals took place. The children's teeth did not loosen. They did not bleed from gums or wiggle under the tongue. When Margaret Delmere inspected their mouths by candlelight, what she saw filled her with something colder than fear, a permanence that did not belong in youth. Clara's teeth, each perfectly aligned, shone with a pale sheen that had deepened from the pearly white of infancy to the faint yellow of old ivory. When her brother Abner grinned beside her, the light caught his teeth too, but they did not reflect like normal enamel. They absorbed it, dull and heavy, as though made of something denser. By 1858, there were 6 Delmere children, each bearing the same uncanny smile. The youngest, Samuel, gnawed on furniture until the corners of tables were grooved with marks too neat to be random. When Elias Delmere scolded him, the boy only said, "They itch." His voice was calm, almost apologetic. He never cried, only pressed his jaw tight, as if to keep something inside. Neighbors who visited brought sweets for the children, but none accepted them. They smiled politely, teeth pressed together, and let the candy melt untouched in their palms. When the family sat for their first photograph, the local portraitist remarked afterward that it was the most unsettling sitting of his career. He wrote in his ledger that the mouths seemed to reflect the flash too strongly, producing streaks across the glass plate. In the final image, their faces were pale, still, and their smiles glimmered faintly, a strange mirage that refused to fade, even as the photograph aged. The portrait hung in the Delmere parlor for years, each face preserved behind dust, the smiles never dulling, never shifting. The town's doctor, Reeve, visited less and less after that. He'd once been curious, keeping records of their development, but by the 3rd child his curiosity had curdled into dread. He wrote, in a letter that survived only as fragments, that the Delmere children's jaws felt too strong by touch the bone beneath like marble, resistant to pulse. He urged Elias to take them north for study, but the father refused. "They are healthy," he said. "They eat little, they sleep soundly, they harm no one." And for a time that was true. The Delmeres kept to themselves. The farm yielded enough, though no one ever saw them slaughter livestock. Their neighbors began to notice that the children never suffered colds, never limped, never lost a tooth. But when they smiled, and they always smiled, it carried a weight that no child's grin should. It was too steady, too knowing, as if their teeth remembered more than their eyes. By the autumn of 1860, the last of the Delmere infants had cut no new teeth, for there were no new ones to cut. The first ones had never fallen. What should have been a cycle of loss and renewal had simply stopped, locked in place. The county dentist once said, half joking, that the family's smiles would outlast their bones. Few laughed. Those who did found the sound catching in their throats because they knew the joke held too much truth. In Wexler County, time wore down everything: crops, barns, even bloodlines, but it never seemed to touch the teeth of the Delmere children. They gleamed on, unchanging, like fossils still alive. The Delmere farmhouse crouched at the bottom of Bishop's Hollow, like something the earth had half swallowed and chosen not to finish. The road to it narrowed from gravel to packed clay, lined with sycamores that leaned close enough to scrape the wagon tops of those few who dared make the trip. The house itself was small, square, and unwelcoming. Its porch sagged under years of damp, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, and its shutters nailed tight, even when the air pressed heavy with heat. There was always a stillness about the place, the kind that made birds veer off mid-flight. From the ridge above, the Delmere land looked gray when the rest of the valley was green, as though sunlight hesitated there. Locals said they never saw smoke rise from the chimney, though the family lived there year-round. They never saw a chicken, a cow, or a crop. The fields around the house had grown over with knotweed and ragwort, and the fences leaned inward, as though tired of guarding what lay within. Yet the Delmeres remained, their curtains drawn, their steps muffled. Once or twice a week, Elias Delmere's wagon would roll into town, the horse's eyes covered with a rag, its reins looped loose as if it were being led by memory alone. Elias would buy only flour and salt, never meat, never grain, and pay always in coins too clean for farm work. At night, when the wind came down through the hollow, those who lived near enough to hear it swore the air carried another sound, faint at first, then rhythmic. It wasn't music, nor the chatter of insects. It was the dry, uneven rasp of grinding, like stone against stone, or molars pressing grain that wasn't there. The noise came from within the farmhouse, sometimes soft, sometimes rising to a steady chorus that lasted until the moon tipped west. One farmer claimed that when he paused by the creek one night, he could make out separate cadences, as if more than one jaw moved in time. He never went that way again. Children dared each other to throw stones at the Delmere fence, but none stayed to see if they struck true. One boy swore he saw a curtain move not lifted by hand, but by breath, like the window itself exhaled. When word reached town that a census taker had knocked at the door and heard no reply but the sound of chewing behind it, the sheriff advised people to leave them be. "They harm no one," he said, though his voice betrayed doubt. Inside that house, the Delmeres sat through seasons without change. The shutters stayed nailed, the lamps burned low, and their pantry remained empty, always empty. Yet the family never thinned. Their faces stayed round, their skin smooth, their teeth, those perfect, aging teeth, showed no sign of hunger. Some said they fed on air, some whispered they fed on themselves, consuming something unseen between them, a secret meal shared in silence. By 1863, travelers had begun calling Bishop's Hollow the Mouth, a name that stuck longer than anyone liked. The road grew soft with neglect, the weeds taller, and the farmhouse sank a little deeper into its hollow each year. Still, the sound continued, soft chewing in the dark, patient and endless. No one ever saw what the Delmeres ate, but in Wexler County, everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever it wasn't food. The year 1861 opened with a brittle winter, the kind that made even the church bells sound thin. The children of Wexler County trudged to the one-room schoolhouse on Bishop's Road with their boots caked in frost and their breath rising in pale ribbons. Among them was Samuel Delmere, the youngest of the brood, narrow-faced and quiet, a boy who smiled too easily and never seemed to blink long enough. He had been admitted to class only after his father insisted, claiming that his son needed to learn among his own kind. No one said aloud what they thought that meant. For the first few weeks, Samuel kept to himself. He copied his letters perfectly, though the teacher, Miss Hattie Lane, noted how his handwriting seemed cramped, as if pressed too hard into the page. He never joined in games, only watched, his lips moving as though silently repeating the words of the others. Then, one pale morning in February, something shifted. The children were playing in the yard, chasing hoops across the frost. One of the older boys, Thomas Greer, knocked Samuel down by accident. Witnesses said there was no fight, no warning, just a blur. Samuel rose, and before anyone could pull him back, he clamped his teeth into Thomas's forearm. The sound it made was not a child's bite. It was a crack, a tearing noise, like green wood splitting. Thomas screamed, blood bright against the snow. Samuel stood there calmly, mouth ringed with red, staring at the wound as if studying it. Miss Lane tore him away and pressed her scarf to the boy's arm, but the flesh around the marks had already begun to turn dark, the edges sinking inward as though the skin itself recoiled. She sent Samuel home at once, trembling as she wrote the incident in her log. The doctor who examined Thomas found no infection, no fever, only a strange blackening that spread but did not blister. As if the flesh had forgotten how to live, he told the sheriff. The bite itself was deep, unnaturally so, each tooth mark clean, almost mechanical in precision. He compared them to iron clamps. Thomas recovered slowly, but the scar never faded. When the school board met the following week, their decision was swift. Not only Samuel, but all of the Delmere children were barred from attendance. The official record cited concern for safety, but in private, Miss Lane confessed she'd heard something else that day after she'd pulled Samuel away and sent him home. From outside, as she bandaged Thomas's arm, she swore she could hear faint scraping from the direction of Bishop's Hollow, like dozens of teeth grinding in unison. By spring, the Delmere children no longer walked the road to school. Their windows were shuttered tighter than before, and their father stopped coming into town altogether. Yet when the wind shifted from the east, the sound still carried faintly through the valley, a dry rasping noise that set dogs to howling. The townsfolk learned not to speak of it. Some said it was only the sound of children at play. Others whispered it was practice. When the war finally loosened its grip on North Carolina, most of Wexler County looked older than it should have. The men who returned came back bent, half-starved and hollow-eyed, and those who stayed behind were no better. Tobacco fields went to seed, barns slumped in on themselves, and the church bell hung cracked, tolling dull each Sunday. Only one family seemed untouched by the slow collapse, the Delmeres of Bishop's Hollow. Neighbors noticed it first at a distance. The children, Clara, Abner, Samuel, and the rest, still walked the same dirt path to the creek, the same narrow silhouettes against the trees. The youngest should have been grown by then, yet each still bore the same smooth faces that had once unsettled the schoolhouse. They were not young exactly, but time's unchanged asterisk, as if the years slid around them. Their eyes did not brighten, did not dull. They smiled when spoken to, but that same cold composure clung to every gesture. When Clara passed through town for salt or cloth, people whispered that she was the very image of the girl who had first appeared 2 decades earlier, down to the freckle by her lip. Some even believed it was the same person altogether, that the children had never grown at all, only multiplied. The parents, Elias and Margaret, did not share this strange endurance. They aged in fast motion. It seemed skin-thinning to parchment, limbs trembling from the weight of air. By the late 1860s, they were rarely seen outdoors. Elias, once broad-shouldered and sharp-spoken, moved like a man carved from brittle wood. Margaret's hair, once a copper halo, hung white and thin as cobweb. Yet their voices still carried when night fell. Neighbors claimed to hear Elias shouting from within the shuttered house, though no words were clear, only a rhythm like prayer recited too many times. Then one summer the voices stopped. The children were seen working the porch alone, washing the railings with rags dipped in something dark that smelled faintly of iron. When the pastor came to call, no one answered his knock. Through a crack in the shutters he saw faces, many faces lit by candlelight, all motionless. He never returned. Within the year, gossip spread that the elder Delmeres had died. Yet no graves were dug, and no preacher was summoned. The ground behind the house, where the family plots were marked by rough stones, showed no fresh earth. Some swore they saw Elias once after that, standing in the doorway at dusk. But when they waved, he did not move. The light caught his features oddly, as if his skin had stiffened. One boy claimed the father's mouth was slightly open, teeth gleaming like those of his children, though Elias had lost most of his own years before. By winter, even that faint sign vanished. The children remained exactly as they had been, bright-eyed and patient, walking the same paths, wearing the same expressions. They did not laugh. They did not age. The valley, once full of rumor, fell into silence. And in that silence, Bishop's Hollow seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting to see what time would do next, only to find that, around the Delmere house, time had simply stopped trying. In the spring of 1869, when the roads of Wexler County softened under thaw and trade began to stir again, a stranger rode into town, a dentist by the name of Dr. Luther Hames. He came from Raleigh, his wagon marked with painted molars and a gold leaf sign that gleamed brighter than the rest of him. Hames was known for his curiosity as much as for his skill, a man who believed every malformation of the mouth told the story of a soul. When he first heard of the Delmeres, it was from a tradesman who laughed as he told it. A family whose children were born with full-grown teeth that never fell out. Hames did not laugh. He said, "That would be a wonder of anatomy," and took the next road west. He arrived in Bishop's Hollow at dusk. The air there seemed thick, as though carrying a hum he couldn't quite hear. The Delmere house stood alone at the valley's base, shuttered and silent. No dog barked, no lantern burned. Yet when he rapped his cane on the porch rail, a door hinge creaked faintly, and someone within answered in a voice too even to be cautious. "Enter, doctor." Inside, the house smelled faintly of iron and soap. The Delmere children stood in a line behind the table, their faces pale in the lamplight, their smiles polite but wrong in ways he couldn't name. When they greeted him, they spoke in perfect unison. He remembered later writing in his notes, asterisk, their tones harmonize like a choir, as though each word has a pitch, asterisk. The eldest, Clara, extended a hand and thanked him for coming. Her palm was cold, her grip delicate. She asked if he would like to see something remarkable. Dr. Hames unpacked his instruments, brass mirrors, forceps, and a small tin of dental casting wax. He had planned only to take impressions for study, nothing invasive. The children obeyed every instruction, opening their mouths in turn. The sight stunned him. The enamel gleamed like polished ivory, unblemished, almost translucent. But it was the depth that unnerved him. When he pressed gently against a molar, he felt it resist, not with the give of bone, but with the unyielding firmness of metal. He poured the wax to capture their form, and as it cooled, the faint hum in the air seemed to shift. He left before midnight, uneasy but exhilarated. Back in his rented room in town, he examined the hardened casts by lamplight. What he saw defied every rule of anatomy. The roots were impossibly long, spiraling downward in coiling patterns that merged together at the base, as though all the teeth were branches of one living structure anchored deep within the jaw. He noted that each mold seemed warm to the touch, though the room was cold. A week later, Dr. Hames told the innkeeper he planned to return to the hollow for a closer inspection. He was last seen loading his trunk at dawn. The wagon left town, but never arrived at its destination. 3 days later, his horse was found wandering the road near Bishop's Creek. The harness was shredded, the bit shattered clean in two, and the inside of the leather reins bore faint impressions, half-circular grooves, evenly spaced, like the marks of teeth. The trunk was recovered weeks later downstream, its hinges gnawed open, its contents gone save for one thing, a single wax cast, cracked down the middle. When held to light, the fracture revealed something embedded deep inside, something hard, white, and unmistakably real. A tooth, fused within its own impression. By the winter of 1870, whispers about the Delmere family had crept from Bishop's Hollow into every pew of Wexler County. The farmers who once only muttered their names over whiskey now spoke openly to their pastors. Children were told to stay away from the hollow, not out of fear of wolves or trespassers, but of something older and more patient. It was the church, finally, that decided to act. The first sermon against them was delivered on a cold Sunday morning, when frost clung to the chapel windows and breath hung like incense in the air. Reverend Amos Childers, tall and thin with a voice that cracked like split wood, declared that the Delmeres bore the devil's jaw. He said their unchanging smiles were the mark of mockery upon creation itself, and that the good folk of Wexler had a duty to protect their souls from such infection. The congregation murmured in agreement, though none met his eyes. A petition was drawn up after service, written in Reverend Childers's own hand, demanding that the Delmeres be barred from the market and from the communion of the town. It gathered 37 signatures by nightfall, though many refused to write their full names, fearing to be known as accusers. When it came time to deliver the paper, Childers insisted he would go alone. "A shepherd does not fear the flock," he said, and set off toward Bishop's Hollow with the petition tucked into his Bible. The road grew quieter the deeper he went. The trees seemed to lean together, their branches forming a tunnel through which the wind did not pass. By the time he reached the Delmere gate, dusk had fallen, and a faint glow pulsed through the cracks in the boarded windows. He knocked once, twice. The door creaked open on its own, just enough for a sliver of candlelight to spill onto the porch. Inside, the room was warm and still. 8 figures stood in a semicircle by the hearth, the Delmere children, though none looked young. Their faces were smooth but ageless, their eyes reflecting the candle flames without blinking. Each one smiled, wide and perfect, as if carved from wax. Childers tried to speak, to read from the paper, but his throat failed him. The siblings' mouths began to move in unison, lips forming words too faint to hear. He stepped closer, thinking perhaps they were whispering a prayer, but there was no sound, only the sight of those mouths moving, perfectly synchronized, shaping syllables that did not exist. The Reverend fled before he realized he'd dropped the petition. When he burst back into the cold, the air hit his lungs like a blow. He ran all the way to town, his Bible still clutched in his hand but empty of its folded page. In later years, he never spoke of what he saw that night, only that silence can be louder than blasphemy. But the townsfolk noticed changes in him. He no longer rang the church bell himself, no longer preached about the devil's jaw. He wore gloves in summer and trembled at the sound of grinding stone. As for the petition, it was never recovered. Some said it burned in the Delmere hearth. Others whispered it was eaten. And when Sunday came again, Reverend Childers kept the chapel door locked and his sermon unwritten, while out in the hollow, 8 candles were seen flickering behind the boarded windows, burning long past dawn. The man's name was Harlan Cobb, a trapper who had hunted the ridges around Bishop's Hollow since boyhood. He knew every sound the woods could make, the snap of a hare's leg in a snare, the distant cry of a whip-poor will, even the muffled tread of a fox slipping through fallen leaves. But in the spring of 1871, the hollow had grown quiet in a way that was wrong. Birds had fled the pines, and the squirrels no longer crossed the creek that bordered the Delmere property. Harlan noticed the change when his traps, once full each morning, began to turn up empty, the bait taken, but the snares undisturbed. One overcast afternoon, he followed the creek downstream, hoping to spot the tracks of whatever clever beast had learned to steal from him. The air was heavy and still, the sort of damp that thickened sound. When he reached the bend near the Delmere land, his hounds began to whine. They pulled against their leads, not in excitement, but in dread. The water there ran slow, dark with silt, and on the bank beyond it, something pale caught his eye, a scatter of bones, small and delicate as twigs. At first he thought them rabbit remains, but as he drew closer he saw there were too many. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, piled in irregular heaps that gleamed faintly even in shadow. Every bone was clean, every joint separated with unnatural precision. There were no teeth marks as he knew them, not the ragged tears of fox or coyote, but neat indentations, perfectly circular, as if something had crushed them between polished stones. He touched one with his boot, and it powdered at once, as though it had been chewed to chalk. Beneath the piles, the earth was pale and dry despite the damp air, and it smelled faintly of iron and something sharper, something like chalk dust ground against enamel. His dogs refused to come near. They backed away, growling low, their tails between their legs. When he stooped to scoop a fragment for proof, one hound broke free and bolted up the trail, howling as though pursued. The other followed. Harlan stood alone for a moment longer, listening. From across the creek came a faint, uneven sound, almost too low to name grinding, rhythmic, like teeth working against bone. The breeze shifted, carrying with it a scent that made his stomach tighten. Not rot, not blood, but something sterile and cold, like boiled ivory. That night, when he returned home, his wife found him sitting by the fire, boots still muddy, his face the color of tallow. He told her the woods were wrong, that the air by the creek smelled of teeth. She laughed at the phrasing until she saw the tremor in his hands. His hounds refused food that evening, snapping at the bowl and whining toward the window. By morning, one was gone, the chain broken. The other was found at the edge of the woods, throat torn open, bones cleaned so smooth they shone. For weeks after, Harlan would not speak of Bishop's Hollow, though he was heard muttering in his sleep, jaw clenched so tight his wife feared he'd grind his own teeth to dust. When questioned later, he said only that something in that valley ate without hunger, that it didn't chew for sustenance but for memory. And in the nights that followed, neighbors along the ridge swore they heard it too, the faint, steady grinding of a feast that never ended. The summer of 1872 was dry enough to crack the riverbeds. Wexler County had not seen rain in 6 weeks, and the crops turned brittle under a sun that never seemed to move. Even the insects were quiet, as though the heat had pressed the life out of them. So when a column of smoke rose from the direction of Bishop's Hollow one afternoon, the townsfolk thought, with grim satisfaction, that maybe Providence had finally decided to handle the matter of the Delmere family itself. The hollow had been left to its silence for too long, and more than one man said aloud that if fire found that cursed house, they would let it burn. From the ridge, the smoke was visible for miles, a dense gray pillar twisting against the clear sky. No one saw flame, but the smell was wrong. It was not the rich tang of burning wood, nor the acrid stench of resin. It was sharp, chemical, and strangely sweet, the way a tooth smells when drilled. Those who stood closest claimed the scent carried something else too, a faint note of milk gone sour, of bone heated too long in a forge. By dusk the smoke had thinned, and a few of the braver men rode down the ridge to see what remained. They expected a ruin, a blackened foundation, perhaps the end of a long fear. What they found, instead, stopped them at the edge of the property. The Delmere house stood intact, its shutters nailed shut as always, its porch sagging in the same tired bow. Yet the ground around it was scorched black in a perfect circle, as if a great compass had drawn the burn. Every blade of grass, every root and stone within that ring had been seared away, but the house itself bore no mark of flame. One of the riders dismounted and knelt to touch the soil. It was still warm. When he lifted his hand, a pale dust clung to his fingertips, smooth and fine as porcelain powder. He brushed it aside and uncovered something glimmering just beneath the surface, a fused white crust that flaked when disturbed. Others joined him, and soon they unearthed chunks of it scattered through the ash. The pieces were curved, some hollow, some solid, all gleaming faintly in the lamplight. They looked, one man said, like melted enamel. No one dared carry any of it home, though a few gathered fragments in jars for the county doctor to examine. By morning, the jars had cracked, the glass veined with hairline fractures as if from within. The dust inside had hardened into smooth, white lumps. The doctor, upon inspection, could only mutter that it resembled fused calcium, something more tooth than stone. When word spread through Wexler County, no one mentioned divine punishment anymore. The story changed shape. Some said the Delmeres had called down the fire themselves, not as destruction but as cleansing. Others whispered that the heat had come from beneath, not above that the ground itself had exhaled flame and spared the house because it was kin to what burned. That night, travelers passing the ridge swore they saw a faint glow beneath the floorboards of the Delmere porch, like coals hidden under skin. The next day, the ring of scorched earth was gone, replaced by new growth, thin shoots the color of ivory, glistening in the sun like teeth erupting from the soil. Those who saw them swore they bent slightly toward the house, as if leaning in to listen to whatever hummed inside. In the summer of 1873, the federal census sent a man named Jonathan Hale to Wexler County. He was a tidy sort, quiet, deliberate, with a habit of touching his pen to his lip when he thought. His colleagues in Raleigh described him as incorruptible, which in practice meant he did not scare easily. He'd walked through mining towns where fever took half the children, and through hills where outlaws still carried muskets from the war. He believed the world's strangeness always had a ledger entry, that every mystery could be squared with a good pen and a calm head. That faith began to loosen when he reached Bishop's Hollow. Locals told him not to bother with the Delmere family. "They don't speak," one storekeeper warned. "They just look." But Hale had his orders, every household accounted for, every name recorded. The Hollow was still government land, and the Delmere homestead, however cursed by rumor, was on his map. So he went alone, walking the last mile when his mule refused the road. The day was bright, but the light seemed to dim as he descended. The cicadas stopped. Even the wind felt thinner. The house looked older than its boards, gray as bone, roof line sagging like a bent spine. The air carried a faint chemical tang, a sweetness he recognized from his dentist back home. He knocked once, twice. On the third knock, the door opened. Not wide, just a crack, enough to show a thin sliver of interior light. A girl stood there. Or rather, a woman who had not changed since the old daguerreotypes he'd seen in the county office. She smiled. Behind her, others appeared, 7 in total. All stood perfectly still, the candlelight cutting their faces in half-shadow. Each wore the same calm expression, the same unblinking regard. Hale cleared his throat and introduced himself, holding up his ledger like a shield. "Government census," he said. "I'll need to record the household." No one replied. Instead, every mouth opened at once, silent at first, then closing with a faint sound that reminded him of tapping stone. He thought it was his imagination until it grew louder, a dry, rhythmic clicking that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. When he asked a question, the sound shifted in tempo, as if answering with punctuation. The more he spoke, the more insistent the clicking became, until it was like rain on tin. He wrote quickly, hands shaking, recording what little he could. Asterisk, 8 individuals present. No elder visible, each smiled in unison. No sound heard save for a faint clicking. Asterisk. Then, something changed. The nearest of them, he thought her name was Clara, from old records, stepped forward. Her smile did not widen, but the muscles of her jaw moved. The clicking grew louder. Hale glanced down at his page and saw the ink shaking from his pen, droplets marking the parchment like tiny black teeth. He fled without closing his ledger. By the time he reached town, the sun had set, and he was trembling too hard to speak. His notes were found days later, sealed in his trunk at the inn. The final page ended mid-sentence, the paper torn across the middle. The edges bore faint indentations, half-circles pressed in pairs, like a row of small bites. Jonathan Hale vanished soon after. His mule was found grazing near the hollow, rains cut clean through. The ledger remains in the county archive to this day, locked behind glass. When the archivist turns the pages, the air smells faintly of enamel, and under lamplight, the torn edge glints with a dull white sheen, as if dusted in powdered bone. Dr. Gertrude Lay arrived in Wexler County at the end of 1873, bringing with her 2 trunks of instruments and the conviction that every superstition could be measured if one had steady enough hands. She was a woman of Wilmington society, educated abroad and twice scorned for claiming that disease often had more to do with minerals in the earth than with morals in the soul. When she heard, through a colleague at the University of North Carolina, about a family in the hills whose teeth did not rot, she called it a localized aberration of mineral absorption and set out to prove it. Her arrival was met with unease. The locals were not accustomed to women who carried microscopes and spoke of anatomy like scripture. They told her the Delmeres were cursed, that their property was unfit for God's creatures. She smiled politely and said curses were only chemistry, misunderstood. Her plan was simple: to collect rainwater from the hollow, soil from near the creek, and, if fortune allowed, a sample of the well water that fed the Delmere house. If the family's teeth were truly unaging, then something in the land had made them so. She lodged with the postmaster's widow in town and spent 2 days mapping the hollow. The 3rd morning brought a storm. Lay waited until the downpour eased, then hiked out with her vials and gloves, boots sinking into the pale mud. When she reached the fence line of the Delmere property, the air changed. The rain there felt heavier, thicker, carrying a faint metallic taste on the tongue. She set out glass jars to collect the runoff, one beneath the eaves, one near the creek where the soil turned gray. She noticed, distantly, that no insects moved, no flies, no gnats, not even the usual post-rain murmur of frogs. The only sound was a faint rhythmic ticking, like water dripping through hollow wood. That night in her room she began her test. She poured 1 vial of collected rainwater into a dish of saline, expecting sediment or clouding. Instead, the liquid blushed red, darkening until it resembled watered blood. She wrote in her notebook, traces of iron and calcium in unnatural proportion. Odor similar to dental decay. Possible contamination from oxidized enamel. She ran the test again, this time with distilled water as a control. The second sample turned red as well. Her letters to the state medical board grew more frantic over the following week. The ratio of mineral to water is impossible, she wrote. If ingested over generations, the result would not be illness but preservation. Teeth, bone, even skin might calcify without decay. In her final note, written in an unsteady hand, she added, the rain does not come from the sky. It condenses from within the hollow. The moisture rises up, not down. The widow who housed her awoke one night to the sound of footsteps pacing the floor above, then silence. In the morning, Dr. Lay's bed was empty, her equipment packed neatly on the desk. Only her notebook remained open, the last page smeared as though someone had dragged a wet hand across the ink. The glass dish on the table still held the crimson solution, but by afternoon it had hardened into a white crust, smooth and glossy as enamel. When the widow tried to scrape it loose, the edge of her knife snapped off cleanly, leaving a shallow mark shaped like a bite. By 1874, Bishop's Hollow had become a problem on paper. County officials, tired of whispers and missing tax records, decided to drain the marshland that bordered the Delmere property. The work was meant to be routine, a trench cut through the valley floor to redirect water into the main creek. A crew of 6 men arrived in late August with shovels, picks, and a mule cart, laughing off the warnings of the locals who told them the land was full of mouths. The first day passed without event, though each man noted how strange the soil felt, fine as flour, pale as powdered bone. When they drove their shovels into it, the sound was dull, not earthy but hollow, like digging into packed ash. By the second day, the air had grown thick with the smell of metal and something faintly sweet. The mule refused to pull the cart closer, braying until one of the men struck it with the flat of a spade. Around dusk, their picks struck something solid. They expected rock or buried timber. What they uncovered instead gleamed white in the fading light, a curve of bone. At first they thought it a deer skull, then a human one, but as they cleared more earth, the shape continued, unbroken, like a spine of jaws laid end to end. Each mandible was perfect, adult-sized, and everyone fused to the next at the hinge, their teeth interlocking so tightly that the whole row formed a single piece. One man pressed his boot against it to test its strength. The bone did not give. Instead, the teeth made a faint grinding noise, as though something beneath still breathed. The men unearthed more 2 rows, then 3, running parallel through the soil like ribs. The jaws were not decayed but polished, their enamel gleaming as if freshly cleaned. Under lamplight they appeared uniform, same size, same alignment, same strange density. No cracks, no fractures, just a seamless pattern repeating deeper into the ground. The foreman, a man named Cates, finally crouched and touched one. It was warm, not with the sun's heat, but with something living. He swore he felt a pulse through his fingertips. No one spoke after that. They shoveled dirt back into the trench without a word, hands shaking so badly they spilled more than they buried. The mule broke loose during the scramble, bolting into the dark. Cates ordered the men to leave the tools behind, to let the ground keep what it wanted. They walked back to town in silence, arriving before dawn, faces gray and eyes hollow. When questioned by the county overseer, none could explain why they'd quit. Only Cates answered, his voice flat. It wasn't ground. It was something growing. Weeks later, a surveyor visited the site to inspect the half-dug trench. He found the soil smooth, as if freshly packed, no sign of disturbance. But his spade struck metal near where the men had worked, a tool handle half swallowed by the earth, its iron head bitten clean in two. The report was filed and forgotten, marked simply as unusable land. Yet those who walked by the hollow after rain claimed the water pooled oddly there, forming long, curved shapes beneath the surface, glinting white as if rows of teeth waited just beneath the mud. In the autumn of 1874, when the leaves along Bishop's Hollow burned red as rust, a notice appeared tacked to the church door in Wexler County. It was short and formal, the ink faintly smudged as if from a trembling hand. Asterisk Clara Delmere to wed Mr. Isaac Marin, carpenter, of Wexler proper. Asterisk. The congregation read it twice, then 3 times, uncertain whether to believe it. Few had seen a Delmere in town for years, and none imagined one of them would marry. Still, Marin was a respected man, quiet but capable, known for restoring barns others swore were past saving. When questioned, he smiled awkwardly and said only that Miss Delmere was strange but kind, and that her family wished to rejoin the world. He visited the hollow often that season, hauling planks and nails under the pretense of repair work. The widow at the general store noticed how, after each trip, his eyes seemed more distant, as though he were watching something behind her shoulder instead of her face. Once, she caught a glint of white at his collar, a small crescent nick just below his jaw, the mark of a bite. He laughed it off, calling it an accident with a lathe. By the first week of November, he had purchased a suit and ordered a gold band from a silversmith in Lexington. The wedding was set for the 10th. The night before the ceremony, Marin was seen drinking alone at the tavern, turning the ring in his hand, its surface already scratched. He left before midnight, promising to ride early to Bishop's Hollow. He was never seen alive again. When he failed to appear for the ceremony, the Reverend and 2 men from town rode out to the Delmere place. The house stood, as always, shutters sealed, no smoke from the chimney. The front gate hung open. Along the fence line they found a small patch of blood in the grass, already dried black. Nearby, something glinted in the pale light. It was a finger cleanly severed at the second knuckle, the gold band still on it, bent nearly flat. The flesh bore a row of half-circle impressions, deep and even, as though crushed between iron jaws. The men carried it back wrapped in a handkerchief, too shaken to knock on the door. When questioned, the Delmeres denied seeing him. Clara stood at the threshold, her face calm, her mouth closed in that familiar, too perfect smile. Behind her, candlelight flickered on 8 motionless figures, each watching, each smiling the same. She said only, "He changed his mind." The sheriff organized a search of the hollow, but no trace of Marin or his horse was ever found. The creek ran red for 2 days after a heavy rain, and a carpenter's hammer was discovered half buried near the bank, its wooden handle gnawed into splinters. The ring was returned to the church for safekeeping. It lies there still, in a drawer few dare open. The band is smooth now, its edges worn by handling, but in certain light the faint indentations remain tiny, perfect semicircles that no human teeth could have made. And when the air grows humid, the gold exudes a faint scent, metallic and sweet, like the breath of someone whispering too close. It began in late winter of 1875, when the air in Wexler County hung damp and still, and frost lingered in the hollows long after sunrise. The first to hear it was Mary Holt, who lived less than half a mile from the Delmere property. She woke one night to what she thought was the sound of crickets, though none should have been chirping in that season. The noise grew louder, layered in a rhythmic clicking that rose and fell in strange waves, like rain against glass but sharper, deliberate. She roused her husband, who sat up listening, his face gone pale. It wasn't crickets, nor was it any bird. It came from the direction of Bishop's Hollow, and it carried a cadence slow, then fast, then slow again, as if something vast and many-mouthed was finding its rhythm. By the next week, others had heard it too. Farmers waking to tend their livestock spoke of a sound that seemed to hum through the soil. Some said it was music, others swore it was a kind of language, a clicking pattern that mimicked the shape of song without melody or mercy. The Delmere house, shuttered as always, stood in the middle of it. On certain nights, when the moon was low, faint candlelight could be seen glowing through the cracks in the boards, flickering in time with the rhythm, as if each beat of that strange hymn had its own flame. One brave soul, a boy of 16, dared to ride closer after hearing the sound from his family's porch. He claimed the noise grew clearer the nearer he came, until he could distinguish separate tones within it, a deep grinding like millstones, and above it, the rapid staccato of something smaller, sharper, alive. He saw shadows shifting behind the window slats and swore they were moving in unison, as if the entire household were swaying to the same invisible song. He fled before reaching the gate. His horse returned at dawn without him, muzzle stained green and teeth cracked as if from clenching something hard. By morning, the neighboring fields had changed. The tobacco plants nearest the hollow were stripped bare, their broad leaves missing, their veins left pale and webbed like bleached lace. The soil beneath them was dry despite the previous night's dew, as though every drop of moisture had been drawn out through roots and veins alike. The farmers stared at the damage in disbelief, finding no prints, no cut stems, only the faintest dusting of white residue on the ground, chalky, soft, and faintly bitter to the tongue. Word spread that the Delmeres had begun a new form of worship, a feast of sound instead of flesh. Some said the clicking was a prayer, each motion of their jaws a syllable to something older than God. Others whispered that the sound was not made by mouths at all, but by teeth grinding themselves together in joy. For weeks the rhythm persisted, always after midnight, always ceasing at the first streak of dawn. When the sun rose, the hollow was still again, but the damage spread further each time. By the time spring came, the hymn had stopped, but the ground around the Delmere property gleamed pale in the morning light, as if dusted in powdered enamel. Nothing grew there afterward, no grass, no weed, not even moss. When the wind blew across the hollow, it carried a faint, brittle sound, the ghost of grinding teeth in the distance, like a choir practicing without end. By the end of that same spring, fear in Wexler County had taken on the weight of duty. The farmers refused to till the fields near Bishop's Hollow, children would not speak the Delmere name aloud, and even the church avoided mention of the family in prayer. When the smoke from the Delmere chimney began to rise again after months of silence, the county could no longer pretend ignorance. The task fell to Sheriff Aaron Wade, a man respected not for courage but for pragmatism. He had survived the war with one good eye and little patience for talk of curses. "We'll see what's there," he told his men, and put an end to fairy tales. He gathered 4 volunteers, a deputy named Crawley, 2 laborers accustomed to grave digging, and a surveyor hired to make a record for the county clerk. They rode out at first light. The air that morning was unnaturally still, the trees holding their leaves as if listening. Wade's horse balked at the turnoff to Bishop's Hollow, but he forced it on, muttering that the devil himself would get no rest from rumor. The path narrowed into a tunnel of brush, and soon the hollow opened before them wide, quiet, and wrong. The Delmere house sat crouched at its center, boards darkened by damp, no door visible behind the nailed planks. Smoke drifted from the chimney, thin and colorless. They dismounted. The men felt at first a pressure in the air, subtle at first, then growing heavy, a pulse that made their ears throb. When Wade rapped the butt of his pistol against the door, the sound came back muffled, like striking flesh instead of wood. Crawley pried at the boards with his axe, but each nail came free reluctantly, the timber seeming to tighten around it. The door finally gave way, revealing not the smell of dust or rot, but of blood left too long in a basin. The room was dim, candles burned to stubs on every surface. In the far corner, beneath the warped floorboards, a hole yawned downward, too neat to be natural. They descended by lantern light, boots scraping against packed stone. The air grew colder, the smell sharper, until the passage opened into a low chamber carved directly from the rock. The surveyor gagged first. Wade lifted the lantern and saw what lined the walls. Rows upon rows of teeth, molars set deep into the stone as if grown there, fused together like coral. Each one gleamed faintly in the light, wet as if freshly washed. The floor beneath them glistened, not with water but with something thicker, the color of marrow. Crawley swore he heard breathing then, a slow, collective rhythm echoing through the rock. The candles flickered, though there was no draft. Wade ordered them out, but the way back seemed longer, the tunnel closing in with each step. By the time they reached the surface, 2 men were gone. The others stumbled into daylight, white-haired and shaking. They said nothing on the ride home. That evening, Wade's report was brief. A cellar dug into rock, it read, walls lined with molars, floor slick as marrow. No names, no measurements, no evidence. The paper was signed, sealed, and burned before midnight. Within a week, both surviving witnesses had left the county, and Sheriff Wade stopped speaking altogether. When asked years later what they found in the hollow, he would only shake his head and whisper, "It wasn't built for people to enter, it was built for something waiting to come up." By the autumn of 1876, the county had begun to lose patience with its own silence. Bishop's Hollow had become a wound on the map, a name spoken with the same unease as plague. No lawman had returned since Sheriff Wade's failed investigation, and the court clerks who handled his burned report whispered of things that had no place in a ledger. Still, officials could not ignore the growing petitions from nearby farms, livestock dying without cause, fields going sterile, the creek running white after every rainfall. The magistrate finally ordered a formal inquiry, not into the Delmere house but into their burial ground, which the records insisted lay behind it. If the family was dead, the matter would end there. If they were not, the county would have reason to act. 4 men were hired from Lexington gravediggers accustomed to hard ground and harder sites. They arrived under orders to exhume all Delmere remains and deliver them to the medical college for inspection. The locals refused to join them. The work began on a gray morning thick with fog, the kind that blurs sound. The diggers found the stones easily enough. Plain markers, initials worn to dust, arranged in two crooked rows beneath a sycamore. The first grave was shallow, the soil pale and fine, almost white. The men joked that the earth there looked bleached. When the spade struck the coffin lid, it made a strange, hollow noise, not the muffled thud of wood against clay, but a dry crack like porcelain splitting. They pried it open. Inside lay no body, no bones, not even the trace of decay, only a mound of fine white dust, compacted smooth, as if carefully poured. One man sneezed and drew back, saying it tasted bitter in the air like chalk. Another touched it and found it faintly warm. By habit, they filled a small jar to take as evidence. Then they moved to the second grave. It was the same. So was the third. 6 coffins, all empty, each containing the same pale substance that shimmered faintly when disturbed. They carried the samples to town that evening, and the county doctor examined them under magnification. What he saw made him recoil. The grains were not uniform, not mineral at all, but fragments curved, layered, translucent. He identified the substance as powdered enamel, ground fine as dust. There was no trace of bone, no trace of decay, only the residue of teeth. When word reached the magistrate, he ordered the dig discontinued at once. The men were paid double to keep silent. 2 of them did not return for their wages. One left town that night, the other went mad within a week, found wandering the ridge, muttering, "They're not buried, they're waiting." The jars of powder were sealed in the clerk's office, but within days the glass began to cloud, white creeping across it from the inside. By month's end, the containers had hardened entirely. Their contents fused to a single smooth mass like porcelain. The doctor tried to break one open, but the hammer bounced as if striking enamel. No further graves were opened. The county declared the Delmere plot consecrated ground, forbidding all future disturbance. Yet those who passed the hollow after dark said the earth behind the house glimmered faintly in the moonlight, as though reflecting something beneath it. And when the wind blew across the field, it carried with it a fine white dust that coated everything it touched, leaving fences, trees, and even the creek's surface shining faintly, like a smile caught in the dark. The rains came without warning. For weeks, the skies over Wexler County had been dry and still, the earth cracked like fired clay, the streams reduced to trickles that glimmered weakly through the roots. Then, in the first days of 1875, thunder rolled in from the mountains, and the heavens split open. The storm did not move on. It lingered, pouring without pause for 7 days and nights. The fields turned to rivers, barns collapsed, and even the stone bridge over the West Creek crumbled under the weight of water. But nowhere did the damage strike stranger or deeper than at Bishop's Hollow. On the 5th night, a boy named Eli Farlow watched from his family's porch as lightning flashed again and again over the hollow. He said it did not strike downward like ordinary lightning but spread across the sky in branching lines, as if searching for something. Between each flash he heard sounds that were not thunder, a deep rumbling that rose and fell in rhythm, like an animal breathing through the earth itself. By morning, the lower ridge had vanished behind a shroud of mist. When the rains ceased, the townspeople gathered what courage they had and rode out to see what had become of the Delmere land. The road was nearly gone, washed into the gully, but the path still led downward into a valley they no longer recognized. Where the Delmere farmhouse had stood for half a century, there was nothing, no foundation, no timber, not even a nail. The fence line was gone, the sycamore that had marked the family plot torn up by the roots. In their place yawned a vast, round basin, a perfect circle carved into the flooded soil. The basin's walls gleamed pale beneath the thin light of day. At first the men thought it stone, but when one climbed down and touched the surface, he found it smooth and faintly warm, like polished ivory. The texture was wrong for rock, more like enamel, slick beneath the fingers. The entire pit was lined with it from rim to floor, forming a bowl that shimmered faintly with trapped water. At its center lay no debris, only a few white stones rounded and fused together, as if once molten. They called for the sheriff, but he refused to go near it. By dusk, the water in the basin had begun to recede, yet no mud remained behind, only that gleaming surface, curved and clean, as if something had swallowed the house whole and left behind the inside of its own mouth. When night fell, the basin reflected the moon perfectly, like an open eye staring back at the sky. In the weeks that followed, the county cordoned off the area, calling it a sinkhole, an act of nature. But those who had seen it knew better. The ground around the hollow trembled faintly for days after, a rhythmic vibration that some swore they could feel in their teeth. The cattle refused to graze anywhere near it, and the air carried a faint sweetness, the scent of something that had been sealed too long and finally exhaled. When spring came, the basin filled with new rain and turned still as glass. It never overflowed again. Locals avoided it, saying the land had done what no man could. It had swallowed its own mouth, consuming the house, the family, and the silence that had once held them. And sometimes, when the wind was low, travelers claimed the water rippled without reason, the surface quivering as if something beneath it were breathing slow, patient breaths, waiting for the next storm to wake it again. By 1901, the story of the Delmere family had passed into the haze of folklore. The old-timers who still spoke of Bishop's Hollow did so in whispers, half ashamed of their belief, half certain the silence itself was watching them. The hollow had long since become a lake, a shallow, stagnant basin that glimmered like a mirror under the sunday. Travelers on the new road said the water had no bottom, only pale shapes gleaming faintly beneath the surface, smooth and curved like bone. That year, a crew was sent from Raleigh to rebuild the county bridge that had collapsed decades before during the floods. The lead mason was a man named Horace Bixby, a practical sort, proud of his craft and utterly without superstition. He and his men worked through July's heat, cutting deep trenches near the creek to secure new footings for the span. On the fourth day, while leveling the foundation, one worker's spade struck something solid. Thinking it a buried root, Bixby stooped to help. Together they uncovered a length of bone heavy, curved, and far too large to belong to any animal they knew. When they washed the dirt away in the creek, the thing revealed itself as unmistakably human, though warped by age and mineral. It was a section of lower jaw, yet thicker and denser than it should have been, the teeth intact and yellow-white as candle wax. Every molar was worn smooth, as though ground endlessly against something harder than food. The bone itself was stone pale, but when Bixby lifted it, he jerked his hand back in shock. It was warm, almost feverish. At first he thought it held the day's heat, but as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the fragment remained warm, as though something within it still pulsed faintly. He wrapped it in burlap and took it to the county office, where the clerk suggested sending it to the Natural History Museum in Raleigh. A week later, it arrived there by rail, labeled Fossil Jaw, possibly Pleistocene. The curator on duty, Dr. Walter Hensley, examined it that same evening. His assistant later recalled that Hensley seemed strangely affected, refusing to leave the specimen room, sitting for hours with the fragment beneath a lamp, fingers resting on the enamel as though listening for something. Before locking up, he remarked that the teeth were unlike any he had studied, each root fused downward into a spiral, merging as though grown from a single origin. The next morning, the jaw was gone. The glass case that held it stood unbroken, the lock undamaged. Hensley's office smelled faintly metallic, and the lamp still burned, its light focused on the empty stand. When the museum board demanded explanation, the curator resigned without a word, surrendering his credentials and leaving the city the same day. He was never seen again. In the years that followed, rumors spread among the museum staff. Some said the fragment had been taken by the Smithsonian, others claimed Hensley had buried it himself. But a janitor who worked the night shift swore that before dawn, he had passed the curator's door and heard a strange sound within, not footsteps, not speech, but a faint, rhythmic clicking, like teeth tapping slowly in the dark. The Delmere story has long since dissolved into the folklore of Wexler County, passed from tongue to tongue like a secret too old to forget, but too dangerous to speak plainly. Most who live there now know the name only as a ghost of a word, a warning muttered to children who wander too close to the marsh. The hollow itself no longer appears on maps. Surveyors tried to chart it again in the 1,920 seconds, but their measurements never agreed, their compasses spinning as though the land beneath were turning of its own accord. The basin where the farmhouse once stood remains still, its surface smooth as polished glass, pale even under shadow. Nothing grows there, not even moss. Only one relic of the Delmeres endures, a photograph, sepia, toned and brittle, kept under glass in the county archive. It was taken sometime between 1865 and 1870, the exact date uncertain. The image shows 8 figures seated stiffly in front of a blank backdrop, their clothing plain, their postures formal. A faint glare runs across the plate, but every face is clear. They appear youthful, yet their eyes hold something timeless, that same calm stillness that unnerved everyone who ever met them. Their mouths are closed, not smiling, not frowning, just sealed in perfect symmetry. But when the image was enlarged in the 1970 seconds for restoration, the technician noticed something strange. Along the line of each lip, just beneath the skin, faint white crescents gleamed. They were not reflections of the studio light. They were shapes, tiny curves, evenly spaced, too numerous to be natural. The archivist who handled the enlargement swore that when she stared too long, she could see the skin around the mouths tighten, the faintest suggestion of motion, as if the smiles beneath were pressing outward, waiting for permission to open. The plate was returned to storage and has not been displayed since. Some say it hums faintly when handled, though no one has stayed close enough to listen twice. And yet, even without the photograph, the story continues. Those who live near Bishop's Hollow speak of a sound that rises from the earth around midnight, a deep vibration felt more than heard. It starts soft, like distant thunder, then grows into a steady rhythm, a grinding, methodical pulse that seems to echo through bone. Travelers who pass that way claim their teeth ache when it begins. The locals do not step outside when it happens. They say it is the land remembering how to chew. As for the Delmeres, the county records list them as family line extinguished. But the old farmers shake their heads at that. They say the family was never extinguished at all, only finished. The teeth that would not fall, the smiles that never aged, the hum that carried through soil and stone, all of it was preparation, not punishment. The Delmeres were not victims of a curse. They were the beginning of something the earth itself was shaping. And if you stand on the ridge at midnight, when the air is heavy and the fields are still, you might feel it rising again, that faint tremor beneath your feet, that low grinding murmur. The sound of a smile that has waited too long to open.